Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Paul, it looks like Germany has passed a huge debt funding spending bill that, in many ways, has the potential to affect all of the EU. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And you've got some thoughts and insights in regards to what Germany is doing and how it's going to affect the EU as a whole.
Well, yes, and first off, thanks for joining as well, Ken. It's always a pleasure when we get together. And yeah, this absolutely has the prospect of taking down the European Union. And I think we'll start first with the fact of what it's going to do with borrowing costs across Europe. And also, Germany's included in this because there is no doubt if you're planning to suddenly spend €1 trillion, whether it's over 5 years, 10 years, and you think you're going to sell that debt to someone, well, you're going to find the yields on that debt will continue to rise. And already what we've seen is, since Germany makes this announcement, that borrowing costs across Europe have begun to rise. So if you look at the yields on what were ironically, of course, called the PIGS countries, which is Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, they were over 30 basis points higher than at the start of March. Now, of course, bear in mind, they were the countries that were left, right, and center of Europe's sovereign debt crisis, going back more than a decade ago, around 2011-12. They actually still have pretty high, and the highest in Europe, debt to GDP ratios. It makes them a lot more vulnerable to higher interest rates. And therefore, what's going to happen in the future as this German, €1 trillion spending spree kicks into effect? I think it's only going to get worse. And the consequences of what that could do is cause huge economic downturns in European countries. It could risk huge problems in the financial system, not just what it does to bond markets, but it risks causing major problems, structural problems inside the banking system, the financial world. So much so you could end up, if you had a sovereign debt crisis going back into, 13, 14, whatever years ago, you risk repeating that all over again. So the argument, of course, to the contrary, which is complete nonsense, is, well, it doesn't matter that Germany was once the nation who was very fiscally disciplined, which they have been, because, if Germany embraces all this deficit spending, they can afford to do so because their debt to GDP levels low, as though that really shouldn't really be an issue in consideration in any case, because it's just a complete myth, because GDP is meaningless anyway. Because as they pump all this money into the economy, all that's going to do is going to be reflected as being GDP growth, which of course it isn't. So the feeling and the fear also inside Europe is that other nations may think, well, we'll do the same. And we can all be far more casual and relaxed about the subject of debt. But if everybody jumps on this bandwagon, never mind what it could do, as said, to banks and bond markets and economies and the broader financial system, this is only going to lead to ever weakening confidence in European countries, in European government bonds. What's that going to do? It's going to cause even higher borrowing costs for all these highly indebted nations. So even if Germany somehow manages to sell this debt to someone, and that's debatable, but I'm sure the European Central Bank don't want to fill the void. The issue is, for most nations, the problem is going to be that the bond vigilantes, so to speak, are going to come in and go, well, the risks are much higher. So if you want to buy your debt, we're going to demand far higher, effectively, yields, premiums to take that debt on board. I mean, so what is obviously doesn't help is that as a consequence of this, German yields have also risen. But the idea is, well, Germany can afford to spend all this money on defense and infrastructure, even though in essence, Germany's kind of austerity is not quite the right word, but they're being extremely frugal. Now they're not going to be anymore. But we know Germany has far, far bigger problems than just this idea of, well, we need some spending somewhere to reignite the economy. I mean, Germany's being deindustrialized by the day. Germany spent far too much money on the Ukraine war, so much so that it's at risk of starting to really impact healthcare, also pensions, and general kind of road and railway maintenance and construction, and the list goes on. They're not going to have any money to spend on anything, but instead they're going to build lots of weapons they don't need to build, and they're going to build a lot of roads to nowhere, as the song goes. And for what purpose, no one actually really understands why that's the case. So this is going to have repercussions inside Germany and then outside Germany as a consequence of this. And the other thing is, it's not even just the peripheral nations that are at serious risk. We know debt levels in the likes of France, for example, have risen sharply in recent years. They're now actually, France has got a higher debt to GDP ratio than Spain and Portugal, if you want to believe that figure to mean anything. And there was a problem with French bonds last year that shows just how quickly the bond markets can become a big problem for highly indebted countries and even the so-called larger economies inside Europe, because France is supposed to be notionally the second largest economy. So the question, therefore, on that basis is, who of all the 27 EU member countries have any real, in the true sense of the word, capability to massively increase fiscal spending? You may argue Germany is, because it's got some headroom because its debt relatively is low. I would also arguably say the Netherlands could do so, but the Netherlands is extremely reluctant to do this. Well, most of the political parties inside the Netherlands are very keen on this idea, but when did what they think matter at all? So maybe one or two other countries. I mean, but obviously, if you have a rise in bond yields, in German bond yields, then you're going to get a widening of interest rate spreads. That's going to increase the financial burden for all the other European countries. And therefore, the likes of France and other countries are going to start suffering rather like the same problems the French bonds had last year. I mean, and the other question is, in terms of bond investors, I mean, are they actually going to be too keen to buy up a load of debt that's all about making warheads and bombs and weapons, etc.? Well, probably, from what I'm hearing, the indication is they're not that keen on doing it. I mean, so who's going to buy this, buy the debt to finance this? I mean, of course, you'll always get people who'll try to claim this isn't a problem, or it doesn't matter about, this increase in spending. Who cares about looser fiscal policies? Because apparently this is going to create faster growth. It creates no growth. I mean, if a government goes to the military industrial complex and says, oh, here's 100 billion this year and we want you to produce a load of weapons, that doesn't benefit the average person in the economy of those countries. It benefits those companies who make massive profits, but no one else benefits from it. So this is ridiculous. I mean, and so they'll always try to make excuses. Oh, all these bond spreads, it's not going to be a problem. And then there's this idea the EU will issue joint debt to avoid individual countries having to borrow more. But you need unanimous support of countries. And I mean, I don't think they're going to get that. And there's already indications they don't even want to give a large number of European nations, even 10, 20, 30 billion more to Ukraine because they're sick and tired of this money being sucked into a black hole. So there's general reluctance. I mean, and then of course the risk is because of the backlash in and this lack of desire amongst countries to have joint debt issuance, then countries will try and find some clever way to get around regulations and finance more spending. And in the end, it will be absolutely disastrous for those countries. And there's even European countries going now, and this is how absurd it is. Well, I tell you what we could do. We could sell some of our gold reserves to pay for this defense budget. I mean, this is how absolutely mind-numbingly stupid the situation's got. And other countries going, I know, we could leverage this on private capital. And we'll find all these creative ways to finance this. But in the end, they are going to risk destroying individual countries, the broader European Union. And, and that's really just the backstory of what this could do by Germany's actions. We haven't even got on to what is actually going to happen and what Germany's even proposing to do. So obviously I've talked for rather a long time there, Ken. So obviously I'll give way to you.
No worries. And there was one point that I was definitely wanted to focus on. The German culture, especially after Weimar and the Great Depression they went through in the hyperinflation. For nearly 100 years, there has been this cultural foundation of not wanting to borrow, not wanting debt, saving, building up. And this is what led Germany to very quickly become the powerhouse in Europe, manufacturing, industrial, economic, etc. So when the Reichstag decided to go ahead and do this vote was literally changing their constitution. Their constitution had been built coming out of Weimar or after World War II not to have this type of deficit spending, not to have this massive borrowing. So not only is it something that the government is doing for the first time in nearly a century, but it's also a matter of the people are suddenly changing their mindsets from becoming savers and investors to now becoming spenders and going into debt and seeing that debt. So it's changing Germany completely by allowing this to happen. And it was kind of interesting because the previous government was majorly on austerity. They didn't spend on anything, and they pretty much were trying to cut, anything that was going in industry. They were doing everything in their power. Of course, it's much of it is ideology, doing everything in their power to destroy the economy. And if you see a lot of different businesses and long-standing companies in Germany, not only are they in decline, but many of them have, especially the auto industry, have been merging with auto companies from different countries. So the actual foundation, the industrial foundation, outside of maybe chemicals and things like that, Germany's industry is a shadow of what it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. So you're right. What are they going to spend the money on? They're not used to having their economy build their industrial and manufacturing base. They're built on more of a like the US, like many of the other countries in Europe. It's sustaining a welfare system, not building infrastructure, not building businesses that create jobs. It's going to be an interesting thing. And with this war mindset, not just of the Ukraine conflict, but this continuous rhetoric that once Russia is done with Ukraine, they're going after all of Europe, which there is no basis, even a shred of evidence pointing to that. But if you're building your entire economy and you're borrowing and your deficit spending and you're setting this hyperbole and propaganda that Europe needs to prepare to go to war. We had Lagarde We had Lagarde at one time, and even the head of the EU, van der Leyen, saying we need to change the mindset to a war economy. And we also have where I think van der Leyen came out and said we need to take the money from savers and put it in investments of our choosing, which would be, of course, towards building the war machine. So is Germany doing this based on what Brussels want them to do, or are they doing it because they're really backed in the corner and they have to rebuild a an economy that has been allowed to decline over the last 20 years? And then, of course, you made the point about the pigs nations. Well, Germany, of course, was the central focal point behind the Troika. That was the lender of last resort during the financial crisis that was buying all their debt and holding that debt over them hostage. Well, what's Germany going to do now when it's no longer the lender of last resort? It's the lender of its own debt. So what's Europe going to do? They are doing everything they can to push China out. They're definitely creating a schism between Europe and the United States because they hate Donald Trump. They're not going to be facilitating any invitation for foreign capital, not just to buy their debt, but to invest in the country. And of course, you have, the what was it? The demands that they have against Russia. So, what is Europe going to do? They need an influx of capital, and they're doing everything in their power to drive it away. And if you're going to drive it away, then businesses are going to go and money managers are going to go invest where their money is wanted.
Yeah, I mean, this is now we come on to what's happening now and why this is a huge problem. And I mean, for a start, you're going to have to service this debt. Oh well, and it'll probably be end up being way over $1 trillion in the next decade. But let's say it's 100 billion a year. I mean, how exactly are you going to finance that? And in the meantime, what does it do, as we said, for the bond markets in both in Germany and Europe? I mean, German banks notoriously had problems, and we're not going to discuss those in great detail, but we know they've got problems. What happens if they have problems in the future as a result of this? Because again, we're back to the fact that banks have balance sheets, and these balance sheets depend on financialization. And if financialization goes in the wrong direction, then you start to risk having problems. The economy is already cratering, and it's cratering because they don't have access to cheap energy. And there's no evidence whatsoever for the foreseeable future they're going to have access to cheap energy, meaning Russian energy. There's a risk now that they might not even get energy from the United States anymore. And so where do they source it from and at what price? So that's an enormous problem. And then, of course, there's just the broader economy. There's no investment in the economy. So whereas the nation deindustrializes because it's all traditional industry that has to give way to new technology. Well, where's the investment in all the new technology they're going to need? I mean, that should be a priority, not this. And it's a pseudo war footing because Europe, as we said all along, has sat there and gone, well, and made noises about sending forces into Ukraine. They always said it's rubbish. And once again, look what's happening. And this is for peacekeeping purposes. All of a sudden, no one wants to put any NATO forces in. Starmer backed down and said, well, no, we don't want to send forces in. Let's have a naval and air contingent. The only country left in Europe still remotely talking about peacekeeping forces are actually France. And Macron said this so many times and then walked away from it because it's not reality. So they're creating this enormous budget for defense, which in the end, the people of European countries are going to stand there and go, well, it's one thing saying you're trying to protect us from Russia, and increasingly people are not buying this, but it's quite another thing when you're allowing the rest of our economy to fall apart and you're doing absolutely nothing about it. And that is a huge problem. So then it starts to spill off into the risk of what that does societally, never mind what it's going to do to the broader economy as more and more industry craters. And of course, there's a huge risk of much higher inflation because of, in the end, the question is at what point are we going to see this? Rather like we will see in the United States, where they're going to have to go and resort to QE again. I mean, QT's virtually ended in the US. QE's coming. It's going to happen in Europe. They're going to have to slash interest rates, which good luck trying to do that in an environment where those buying the debt are going to be looking at the writing on the wall going, well, I'm not going to accept buying this debt with that yield. I'm going to demand much higher. And so the bond markets are going to turn into absolute chaos. And they're not thought of any of this because they just go, well, our debt to GDP is low, and we don't need to worry about the broader economy because, again, it's all back to financialization. They seem to have forgotten that in the real world, Germany's in serious trouble, France is getting there, Italy's getting there, and countless other European nations are all queuing behind in this huge, enormous problem that's brewing. And this is why Germany taking this course of action could indeed be the catalyst to destroy Germany and destroy the so-called periphery nation, which is a bit of an insult to them. And therefore they could take down the whole of the EU. And this is not pie in the sky thinking. This is a major problem in the making because you can see from what we've discussed where the problems are, where you can envisage the difficulties going forward. And it's not as though Europe has a strong economy anyway. Absolutely not. And the Ukraine war has caused mayhem to many economies, not least because of the lack of access to cheap energy. But that's not the only problem. It's trying to finance a war they couldn't afford to pay for. And now apparently they're going back for more to buy weapons, which will do nothing for the broader economy. They can sit there and go, we had economic growth this year of 3%. Oh, look, everything's great. Meanwhile, the average person is increasingly becoming poorer, lack of job security, cost of living's rising, because you can see inflation is going to be a problem, whether it's in the United States, Europe, including the United Kingdom. And therefore, that's why this discussion is important, because this is something that can happen very rapidly. We're already seeing problems in bond markets, both in Germany and on the so-called periphery, almost immediately. This is not going to go away anytime soon. And you can have the DAX rising to all-time highs again. But in the end, it's meaningless. What matters is what happens in the real world. And there's no way, in any way, shape, or form, you can fix the real world unless you actually start to take measures, both economically and financially, to address those problems. And that includes access to cheap Russian energy, but also, of course, access to Chinese finance and what China will demand as a result of financing those requirements. It's a simple, plain, as the nose on your face reality, but as usual, the Europeans don't want to face it, rather like they didn't want to face the reality and still don't, that Ukraine could never win the war.
Yeah, I want to add a couple final points. It's interesting that Europe has decided to make strange bedfellows with Jelani in Syria because of the potential of a pipeline going from Qatar through Syria into Europe to replace Nord Stream. Then, of course, you have to ask this question. What does Europe, especially going forward into the new economy, what do they produce? Do they produce chips? No. Do they produce any AI? Have we seen any AI come out from Europe? No. Social media or internet-based platforms? No. As a matter of fact, when they simply try to find or make it difficult for Chinese or American social media platforms and enterprises to actually function in Europe. Why? Because they don't have their own. And then I think it was either van der Leyen or Lagarde, one of the two, made this point sometime in the recent past, where if China comes in with building companies and capital, they need to provide all of that IP to European companies so they can do it. And with that being the case, who in the hell is going to invest in Europe? And if you're just going to create all this debt eventually, like in 2010, and what we're seeing with some of the banks going right now, there's going to be hell to pay, and there's going to be nobody to step in and help them the way the Chinese helped the US back in 2008, 2009. Anyway, Paul, was there any other points you wanted to
No, I
make
think that's
regarding
fine.
this?
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, as always, Paul, for being a part of the discussion and for your insight.
Yeah, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.